So thank you for choosing to be here with us today. I know you have lots of choices, and I'm glad you decided to be here with us, with this group, with this spiritual community. And I also want to thank those people who showed up last week to support Reverend Jeff Hargis. He was new. I remember those days. He was nervous. He did pretty good considering. And he did pass his licensing panels the next day. So he's on his way to being a fully licensed, ordained minister and all that whole story thing. And thank you also to Maria, who drove the Zoom bus last week, so I could have my first Sunday off in 25 months, even if it didn't turn out exactly like I planned. More on that in a few minutes. But today we start a new month and a new monthly theme. Your hidden garden. If I could have, no, I probably wouldn't want it, but I was going to say if I could have a magic mirror that would let me see what it is that I meant when I set things up, I might be surprised sometimes because I didn't know when I created this monthly theme and these group of talk titles that we're building the services for the month around. I had no idea what I was doing. But you know that if you operate intuitively like we do. So anyway, this month, we're talking about our hidden garden. And each one of us has an internal garden within ourselves. And this is the real place where we do our work, where we do our real gardening, where we really tend to our lives and our experiences, because the only place, as you know, the only place we can do our work is right here between our ears, because what we think shows up in our lives. And we forget, right? Because we don't remember that it's what we truly believe and what we focus on and what we give our energy to and what we get all fixated on and what we worry about and what we get anxious about and what we perseverate on. That's the hamster wheel that goes round and round and round. That's what creates our experience. This is a hard idea to grasp because it's so completely and totally contrary to what our five senses say and our cultural conditioning says. And another part of what makes this challenging is it's not how we came into the world when we were young, babies, toddlers. We were sensitized to paying attention to those tall people, those grown-ups in our lives, whether they were parents or caregivers or whatever, because they hopefully took care of us and they hopefully made sure we had what we needed. And we learned to take our cues on whether we were acceptable or not, and whether we were lovable or not, and whether we were okay enough or not from them. And I have a friend who posted on Facebook yesterday that she had a hard time receiving anything good in her life. And she connected that to an experience when she was a newborn. She was premature. And so she spent the first month of her life in an incubator, completely deprived of human contact. And as a result of this early conditioning that she got, not because anybody was doing anything wrong, that's how they handled preemie babies back then. But as a result of not being touched for the first month of her life after the doctor delivered her, she had been living from the belief that she can't get what she needs. It's not available to her. And she's learning ever so slowly that it is okay for her to have her needs met. And it is okay for her to receive good. It's an extreme situation. And yet all of us have stories that we carry around in our heads that give us information that may be completely false. And yet it is our framework. And we have the task and the joy of realizing and recognizing we have a different opportunity in front of us, a different kind of flower we can grow in the hidden gardens of our minds, or fruit, whatever, whichever you wish. But we have to pay attention to what we think and what we feel and what we worry about and what we fret about and what we're anxious about and what we're like crazy out of our minds about. Because if we don't do that, we're not managing our gardens. And that includes pulling weeds, uprooting those things that don't give us the life experience we choose. And the only person that can do that for us is us. It really sucks, I know it does, but it's true. We have to pull our own weeds. Nobody else can do it. We have to manage those feelings of anxiety. We have to manage those feelings of fear, those worries, those doubts, those frustrations. And we have to be consistent in pulling the weeds all the time. Sorry, that's just how it works. So I have dozens and dozens and dozens of stories that I could share from my experience from this past week. And I'm not going to give them all to you because I try to keep the talk down to 20 minutes. But I'm going to give you the tiniest bit of background and then tell you some of the things that I became more consciously aware of this past week. So Sunday, on my day off, I went up to Tohono and I was walking around the gardens and I was enjoying it. It was a beautiful day. And I went and got pizza for lunch. And before I even got 2 bites of my pizza, I was throwing up blood. Yeah, it's not good. So I ended up in the ER at one of the local hospitals on Sunday afternoon. And I don't have a history of visiting ERs. I've never done that before for me. I don't have a history of throwing up blood. That's not something that happens to me. They took me in pretty quick because, you know, people don't generally throw up blood. And even though hospitals are completely full everywhere, and they don't have staff, and they don't have rooms, and they don't have beds, they took me in. And they put me on the care that somebody with a GI problem would get. Fortunately, it's standard. So they didn't even have to figure out what was wrong in order to start putting me back together right. So I spent like almost 3 days in ER because there were no beds. And they couldn't release me from the hospital until they figured out what was wrong. And in order to figure out what was wrong, I needed to have a room assigned to me. And there were no rooms. I mean, it's almost like the Jesus and Mary story, right? There were no rooms. And they couldn't do the endoscopy until they had a room. And I wasn't sick enough for ICU, and I wasn't sick enough for any place else. And there were no beds anyway. And so here I am stuck in ER, which is not the nicest place to be, honestly. And it was the middle of the night, the second night that I was there, stuck in my little cubby hole of a room with IVs in both arms and a heart monitor and all this other shit. And I started feeling sorry for myself. And nobody's surprised at that, right? I mean, you'd feel sorry for yourself too. I had hoped that by then they would have figured out what was going on so they could fix it and send me home. But I noticed I was feeling sorry for myself. I noticed what was going on in my mind, what was going on in my mental body, what was going on in my awareness. And I mentally grabbed myself by my attention and said, stop it. I made myself shift my focus and my attention. And I started looking for things to be grateful about. I had amazing care, incredible care from the superhumans we call nurses. The head of ICU came down in the middle of the night and woke me up one night. And she, pulled my bangs out of my face and patted me on the head and said, I hope that wasn't your favorite t-shirt because it's kind of messed up. And I started feeling grateful I started feeling grateful knowing that this issue, whatever it was going to be resolved. And it was going to be resolved beneficially. Even though there were no beds, even though there was no apparent way for the doctors to fix it. Because they didn't have a bed, they didn't have a room, they had no way to take care of me. And yet I knew that there was a solution. And as soon as I was able to shift that in my consciousness, what happened? Well, gosh, golly gee willikers, they found a bed. They found a bed and they were able to do the test I needed and figure it out and send me home. And before that could happen, I had to get a hold of myself. And I had to look at why I was feeling sorry for myself. What was going on? I had expectations. Have you ever had expectations where you expected life to be different than it was? Well, what do we do to ourselves when we have expectations? We set ourselves up for failure and disappointment. We set ourselves up for resentment. We set ourselves up for failure. And it's nothing that's going on in the world outside of our eyes. It's what we're thinking. And the law says, you know this, the law says, sweetheart, I will give you what you're thinking. It's like, oh, wait, what am I thinking? It is done to us as we believe. As we truly believe, that's what we're going to get. We get what we put our emotional energy toward. We get what we put our intention toward. And if I had stayed stuck in, oh my God, this is horrible, this is miserable, blah, 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 I could still be in the hospital instead of sitting here talking to you like this. And if we're not conscious of what we believe, we get carried away by cultural conditioning, which tells us, oh my God, life is horrible. We have to be in charge of our gardens. And the gardens live in our heads. That is the only place they live. This is hard because we're not used to managing our minds and being in charge of our impulse actions, our sort of things that rise up naturally within us. I'm not saying stuff those things. I'm saying be conscious of them and decide and deal with them purposefully and intentionally. And this is really contrary to how the world works and how the world tells us things work. Because in our five sensory experience, what happens out here, the world tells us we need to care. And Science of Mind teaches that's not necessarily so. We need to be aware of it. But what we care about is what we decide to think and what we decide to believe and what we decide to focus on. So Dr. Holmes, in the Science of Mind textbook in chapter 16, the chapter is called The Principles of Successful Living. On page 266, Science of Mind is not a get-rich-quick scheme. Neither does it promise something for nothing. It does, however, promise the one who will comply with its teachings that they will be able to bring greater possibilities and happier conditions into their experience. We do not teach you what you want. You can get what you want. Paragraph 3. While we could not expect to demonstrate that which is contrary to the nature of our own existence, which is love, we not only believe, but we know that it is entirely possible through mental treatment, through right thought and right belief, to greatly influence our environment, its reaction to us, the situations we meet, the conditions we contact. There is such a thing as demonstrating control of conditions. There is such a thing as demonstrating control of conditions. We shall be able to prove this in such a degree as we are successful in looking away from the conditions that now exist, what we experience, while accepting better ones. Not only must we accept this intellectually, but our acceptance must become subjective. It must become embodied. And the intellect furnishes the mental picture. I could read you the whole chapter. Most of you have this book. You can read it for yourself. I recommend that you do. Every single one of us has a hidden garden. It lives between our ears. And from that place, we interpret and we give meaning to all of the experiences that happen in front of our eyes. For everything that we see on the web, for everything we see on the streets, for everything that we experience in our bodies. We have the power to change our point of view. And only when we are willing to see what our point of view actually is and grab it with both hands and say, excuse me, no, that's not what I choose. If we're not willing to do that, we are just pulled. We are just dragged by stuff that is actually in our control if we choose to grab the reins and drive our own mind. So the other night in the emergency room, I had the good fortune and enough training and practice to remember that I could redirect my thought and have a different experience, which is what I did the entire rest of that night and the next day, every single time I was awake. And because I was able to use my intellect, this stuff that happens between my ears, I could furnish a different mental picture, a different mental equivalent. And because of that, my experience changed. And I was still hooked up to all this technology, and I was getting IVs in both arms and, good drugs coming in. But my point of view, my frame of reference, and my experience changed. And yes, the nurses and techs kept waking me up at all hours of the night, but I had no further experience of turmoil. And I was able to get curious about what was going on around me, instead of being positively certain that this was terrible, horrible, yucky. And because I was able to get curious and I was able to manage my internal state, they found a bed. They did the test. They sent me home. I walked out of that hospital. I drove myself home, not because I was stubborn, which I am, but because I was well. Because I was able to manage my point of view about what was happening in my life. Now, what happened? I don't exactly know. I do know that there were half a dozen people at fairly high levels in this hospital, people in charge of room assignments, finding a bed to put me in, finding a room to put me in, so that the GI doctor could run the test, right? But if I had fallen in the pit or fallen in the well of, oh my God, ain't it awful? I could still be there. And it's not necessary. And it's really hard to pull our own weeds, because everything in cultural conditioning tells us we don't have that authority, but we do. So earlier the second day, the fellow who would eventually become my supervising physician stopped my bed in the emergency room. And we talked about all the usual causes for what I was having, and nothing about my lifestyle or my behaviors fit the pattern. And those of you who studied Dr. Lissa Rankin's book, Mind Over Medicine, with me last year will remember that she wrote that many of the reasons that people get ill come down to two things. 1, stress. 2, the feeling of not being connected, which is another stressor. I didn't tell him about Dr. Lissa's work. It wouldn't have served anything. But I did tell him I thought stress was probably a major contributor to my situation. And then I told him that I hadn't had a real day off in 25 months. And he looked at me like I was crazy. And he said, maybe I needed a different day job. And I said, quite honestly, I couldn't argue with that. And I had already started working on ways to change my experience of my day job to make it more humane for me. And obviously, there was more work for me to do. And now that I had seen the consequences of my previous decisions, it was much clearer in my mind how urgent it was. It's not just about changing our minds. It's about changing how we speak, how we engage, how we interact, what we do. But we change our minds first, and then we embody that change. We embrace that change. We allow that change to happen in our lives. But the mental change is the hardest, honestly, and it's the one that has to come first. So the long and short, the people that assigned rooms figured out a way to play musical chairs and found me a room. And all the doctors kept saying, you're way too healthy to be here. The GI doctor did the endoscopy and, figured out what went on with my physiology. And they worked out a plan to support my health, and they sent me home. It wasn't hard. It wasn't stressful. After the initial traumatic experience, which was traumatic. And what was cool to me was I felt seen. I felt heard. I felt looked after. I felt cared for. I felt appreciated and respected. I felt supported, and I felt like I mattered. And I felt like I wasn't just some old lady that the hospital staff had to take care of. This is amazing, this story that I'm telling you, because it's so outrageous and outlandish, because, it's kind of a catastrophic thing. And the experience, once I changed my mind about it, became something entirely different. So one of Keith Gorley's favorite passages from the Science of Mind text is on page 268, paragraph 2. The law is a law of liberty, but not a law of license. It is exact and exacting. And unless we are willing to comply with its nature and work with it along the lines of its inherent being, we shall receive no great benefit. The next sentence is in all caps. So Dr. Holmes was yelling, every one of us must pay the price for which we receive, and that price is paid in mental and spiritual coin. What does it mean to pay the price in mental and spiritual coin? What does it cost each one of us to have a different experience than we do right now? We have to recognize that the law must give us what we truly believe, what we give our emotional power to. And in order to have a different experience, we have to change what we focus on, what we think about, what we ruminate about, what we fret about, what our default setting is. And we need to weed all that garbage thinking out of our hidden gardens. The gardens exist. They've already been planted. We've planted them, our parents planted them, society planted them. We have to weed our garden. I'm really delighted that I get to talk about the hidden garden all month. This is that plot of ground in our own heads that each one of us, that's where we have to work. That's where our work is. And those of you who have taken foundations know this. You spent back in foundations, and I'll remind you, because most of you have taken this class. That week in Foundations, when you got to look at what your self-talk was like. It's the stories we tell ourselves and about others and about our beliefs about ourselves and our beliefs about others. That's what we garden. And we have to work at, I wish I had a different word for that. We have to spend our time and energy on growing the fruits we wish to experience and growing the fruits we wish to see in the world. Law is mechanistic. It can only give us what we focus on. Our job, our real, only true job, is to be in charge of that focus. My challenge for each one of you, each one of us, is to pay attention and notice when we're having an experience that we don't like or don't want, whether it's an experience we're having for ourselves or something we're experiencing for somebody else. To stop and pay attention and notice the weeds. Pay attention to the beliefs, pay attention to the thought processes, pay attention to those emotional urges that rise. Pay attention to that personal history that gives us bad data. Garbage thinking that we subconsciously believe on how it's appropriate for us to live or somebody else to live. And even just by taking that moment to shift our automatic reaction helps us and helps clear our world and everybody else we come in contact with. But we've got to weed the garden. And we've got our hands full. Every single one of us has our hands full, weeding our own garden, taking care of our own perspective and perception of our world. So I'm going to close with a little brief reminder from the Persian mystic poet Rumi. If you knew yourself for even one moment, if you could just glimpse your most beautiful face, maybe you wouldn't slumber so deeply in that house of clay. Why not move into your house of joy and shine into every crevice? For you are the secret treasure bearer and always have been. Didn't you know? We get to be that secret treasure bearer for ourselves and for each other. We get to weed our garden. We get to see our world through the eyes of love that we wish to see. And anytime we find ourselves pulled off that game, we get to refocus and re-engage and talk with ourselves and our world from the point of view we wish. That's our work. That's what we are called to do. And every one of us has the tools. I'll repeat that. Every one of us has the tools. It's practice. And practice and practice and practice and practice. Do that. Bless yourself and bless us all. Thank you. So I'm going to roll into the prayer. And I'm going to remember with you and you and every single one of us that there is only love. There is only light. There is only joy. There is only peace. There is only order and harmony and goodness. And everything else we make up. So I remember that one life that lives as me, lives as each beloved here. And it manifests as joy and order and life and love and peace. And even though I might not have that experience in every moment, I have the opportunity to take another look. I have the opportunity to take a breath and reimagine my life as I wish it. Reimagine my experience as something uplifting. Reimagine my focus as a focus on the good. Reimagine my angst and fear and upset as the good I wish to see. I know that darkness can only be chased out by the light. It has no being of its own. It has no substance of its own. I give it substance when I've screwed up my thinking. And so I remember to turn on the light. I remember to be the light. I remember to be the love. I remember to be that presence of harmony and peace and joy and goodness. And I remember that as I shine that light, I add light to the world. I add love to the world. I add goodness to the world. And I remember it's not hard. I remember it's a constant practice. And I remember it's completely within my skill set and in the skill set of each beloved here. This opportunity that we have to manage ourselves is the greatest gift we could have already been given. And we have been given it already. So I choose to use the gift I've been given. And I choose to manage my mind. And I choose to focus on the good. And I choose to see and be that love in the world. And I know that for each and all, that each one already is that good. Each already is that love. Each already is that joy, that delight, that groovy, wonderful nature that each one of us already is. So I remember that it's quite okay to focus on the good. It's quite okay to focus on the peace and the joy and the harmony. And when I get pulled off, I remember it's quite okay to rethink my experience and reset my mind to see the world as I choose it. Relaxing into this, I take a breath, I allow, and I let it be. And so it is.